My name is Elena Cross. I'm 34 years old, and at exactly 6:12 p.m. on a Thursday, everything I thought I understood about my family finally became clear. I was standing in the service hallway of the hospital, still in my coat, my badge clipped slightly crooked after a long shift. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. My phone vibrated once in my hand. A voicemail. I almost ignored it. Almost. But something made me press play. My mother's voice came through. Calm, polished, controlled. The same voice she used in public when she wanted to sound composed, respectable, untouchable. You've been disconnected from this family. Don't contact us again. We're moving forward without you. And then, click. No hesitation, no emotion, just a clean, deliberate ending. I didn't react right away. I didn't cry. I didn't call back. I just stood there, staring at the gray concrete wall in front of me while a janitor rolled a cart past, the wheels squeaking faintly against the floor. Somewhere down the corridor, an alarm beeped in steady intervals. I replayed the message once, then again. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to hear the tone, the certainty, the quiet finality. That was the moment something shifted, because it wasn't just rejection. It was recognition. They weren't pushing me away in anger. They were saying out loud what they had been practicing for years, that I only belonged when I was useful. And standing there in that hallway, phone still in my hand, I realized something even colder. They thought they were letting go of a problem, but what they had actually cut off was the only system holding everything together. Before we continue, I want to ask you this question. What would you do if the people who call you family only wanted you around while you were still useful and abandoned you the moment you were no longer helpful in their lives? And if you've ever been the quiet person behind the scenes handling everything, please like and subscribe to the channel to continue following. Because what happened the next morning proved something shocking. When the problem disappears, sometimes the entire illusion crumbles with it. At first, it would be easy to believe that everything changed in that hallway. That one voicemail, one sentence, one clean break. But the truth is, nothing actually started there. That moment didn't create the fracture. It simply exposed it. Because long before my mother ever told me not to contact them again, there had been a quieter, slower pattern unfolding beneath everything we called family. And if I'm being honest, I had always known. Just not all at once. Not in a way I was willing to name. It started small, almost invisible. At first, I was just the one who understood things. The one who could read documents no one else wanted to read. The one who noticed details other people skipped. When bills came in with confusing terms, they handed them to me. When contracts showed up with fine print, they asked me to take a quick look. And when something went wrong, when numbers didn't add up, when deadlines were missed, when penalties started creeping in, I became the person who stayed up late fixing it. At the time, it felt like responsibility, like maturity, like being the reliable one in a family that needed stability. And for a while, I wore that role almost proudly, because being needed feels a lot like being loved when you don't know the difference yet. But then slowly the pattern deepened. What used to be occasional help became expectation. What used to be gratitude became silence. And what used to be small problems became entire systems that only worked because I was inside them. My parents started making decisions they didn't fully understand. Financial commitments, property transitions, tax structures they couldn't maintain without intervention. They didn't ask whether they could handle it. They assumed I would. My sister learned even faster. She didn't study systems, she studied reactions. She figured out that urgency worked. That if she sounded overwhelmed enough, emotional enough, desperate enough, I would step in before the consequences caught up to her. And I did, every time. Not because I was weak, but because I believed something that took me years to unlearn. That if I didn't fix it, everything would fall apart. And if everything fell apart, it would somehow be my fault. So I became efficient, quietly efficient. I reviewed contracts they never read. I corrected tax filings they never understood. I built payment structures they couldn't sustain and translated the consequences into language they could ignore. No one called it work. No one acknowledged the scale of it. But everything ran smoother when I was involved, and everything stalled the moment I stepped back, even slightly. Looking back now, I can see the shift more clearly than I could then. I wasn't just helping anymore. I had become infrastructure, not the visible part of the house, the polished floors, the curated furniture, the image they showed the world. I was the wiring behind the walls, the system that kept everything functioning as long as no one looked too closely. And like most infrastructure, I was only noticed when something broke. That was the part that changed me the most. Not the workload, not even the pressure, but the silence. Because every time I fixed something, it disappeared. No conversation, no acknowledgement, no correction of behavior, just relief, followed immediately by the next problem and the next. There was no end point, no moment where someone said, "We've asked too much," no boundary that wasn't quietly pushed further the next time something went wrong. Instead, there was a different kind of reinforcement, subtle, repetitive, almost invisible. Whenever I questioned something, I was too harsh. Whenever I hesitated, I was overthinking. Whenever I tried to step back, I was reminded, gently then firmly, that family helps each other. That phrase, it sounds warm, supportive, moral even. But in my family, it didn't mean mutual care. It meant access. Access to my time, my skills, my emotional bandwidth, without accountability, without reciprocity. And the longer I stayed in that role, the harder it became to see it clearly. Because from the inside, it didn't feel like exploitation. It felt like an obligation. It felt like loyalty. It felt like being the one person who could keep everything from collapsing. Until eventually, something shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly enough that I almost missed it. I realized there was never going to be a final crisis, no last emergency where everything would stabilize and I could finally step back. There would only ever be a rotating cycle of problems tied together by one constant assumption, that I would always be there to fix them. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it, because it reframed everything. Every late night, every rushed solution, every time I postponed something in my own life because this was urgent. It wasn't temporary, it was structural, and I was the structure. So when my mother left that voicemail, cold, controlled, final, it didn't confuse me. It clarified something I had been avoiding for years. They didn't lose me in that moment. They revealed how they had always seen me, not as a daughter, not as an equal, but as a system they assumed would never shut down. And for the first time in my life, I started to wonder what would happen if it did. For a long time, I thought decisions like this would feel dramatic, that there would be a moment, loud, emotional, unmistakable, where everything inside you finally breaks and you react. But that's not what happened. There was no explosion, no tears, no late-night confrontation filled with words I'd been holding back for years. Instead, there was silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from confusion, but from clarity. After I listened to my mother's voicemail for the second time, I didn't argue with it. I didn't try to reinterpret it. I didn't tell myself she didn't mean it. Because for once, I understood exactly what was being said. And more importantly, I understood what wasn't. There was no "call us back." No, "we need to talk." No space left open for reconciliation, just a clean instruction: don't contact us again. So I didn't. That was the decision, and it didn't feel powerful at the moment. It felt precise. I typed a single word into my phone. Okay? No punctuation, no explanation, no emotion attached to it, just acknowledgement. Because if they were finally going to say it out loud, if they were going to define the boundary themselves, then I was going to respect it exactly as given. Not soften it, not interpret it, not rescue them from their own words. And that was the first shift. Small, almost invisible, but irreversible. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I was anxious, but because something in my mind had already moved forward. There was no part of me waiting for an apology, no expectation of a follow-up message, no internal debate about whether I should reach out. That loop, the one I had lived in for years, was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar: stillness. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't think about what they needed. I thought about what was real. Because here's the part most people don't understand about situations like this. When you are deeply embedded in someone else's system, financially, legally, structurally, walking away is not emotional. It's operational, and operations have consequences. So instead of reacting, I did what I had been trained to do. I assessed what access points existed, what dependencies were active, what processes still had my name attached, what assumptions were they still making about my role. And once I saw the full picture, the next steps became obvious. I didn't delete anything. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't make a single move out of anger. I simply began to withdraw, carefully, methodically, completely. First, I notified the transaction coordinator that I was no longer acting as the verification contact for the property file. Then, I sent a brief formal message to the broker clarifying that I had revoked all communication authorization related to the deal. No accusations, no explanation, just a change in status. Next, I went through every shared access point I had ever been included in: accounts, logins, document chains, anything that depended on my presence to function smoothly. I flagged them, suspended them, or removed myself entirely, not to create damage, but to remove assumptions. Because the real risk wasn't that they would fail, it was that they would continue operating as if I were still there. And I wasn't going to allow my name to carry a system I was no longer part of. After that, I sent one final message to the family accountant: short, professional, clear. Any documentation previously routed through me would need to be resubmitted without my verification. No attachments, no commentary, just a boundary. And with that, I stopped. No follow-up, no monitoring, no checking to see what happened next. Because for the first time, I understood something that had always been hidden from me. I was not responsible for what happened after I withdrew. That responsibility belonged to the people who had chosen to continue without me. By the time I closed my laptop, it wasn't even 8 a.m. The world outside looked exactly the same. Traffic moving, people walking, the normal rhythm of a weekday morning continuing without interruption. But underneath that surface, something had already shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but structurally. Because systems like the one my family had built don't collapse all at once. They fracture, quietly, at the points where support is removed, and I had just removed mine. I didn't wait for the fallout. I didn't sit there anticipating their reaction. Instead, I went to work, reviewed files, answered emails, moved through my day the way I always had. Except this time, there was no background noise, no constant anticipation of the next crisis, no mental space reserved for problems that weren't mine. Just focus. Clean, undivided, mine. And somewhere, not far from where I was sitting, things were beginning to slow down. Processes that used to move quickly were pausing. Requests that used to be approved instantly were being questioned. Verifications that used to pass quietly were now incomplete. Not because anything had been broken, but because something essential was no longer there. That's the thing about invisible roles. No one sees them while they're functioning, but the moment they're gone, everything else starts to feel it. And for the first time, I didn't step in to fix it. I let it unfold. If you had walked into my kitchen that morning, nothing about it would have looked dramatic. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no visible signs that anything significant was happening at all. Just a laptop open on the table, a cup of coffee slowly cooling beside it, and me, sitting still, calm, focused. But underneath that quiet surface, I was dismantling something, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. Because once I understood the truth, once I saw clearly that my role in my family wasn't temporary, wasn't optional, wasn't even acknowledged, I also understood something else. You cannot exit a system emotionally if you are still embedded in it structurally. And I was embedded everywhere. So I didn't start with feelings, I started with access. That's how professionals do it. When one party formally cuts communication while still relying on your operational presence, the correct response isn't confrontation. It's withdrawal. Precise, documented, complete. First, I opened the property transaction file, the one my parents had been proudly describing to their friends as a seamless transition into a gated townhouse near the lake. I already knew it wasn't seamless. I knew how many moving parts were involved. Temporary escrow positioning, linked accounts, verification chains that depended on consistency, and most importantly, on credibility, mine. So I drafted a message to the transaction coordinator, short, neutral, unemotional. I informed them that I would no longer be serving as the verification contact for the source of funds documentation or any related authorization chain. No explanation, no justification, just a change in status. Then I hit send. Next came the broker. This one required even less language. I revoked communication authorization tied to my name, clarified that I should no longer be included in any correspondence related to the transaction, and requested confirmation of receipt. Again, no emotion, because this wasn't personal, it was procedural. After that, I moved through the system piece by piece. Every shared login, every document thread, every platform where my access had once been seen as convenient. I flagged them for review, suspended what needed to be paused, removed myself where appropriate. Not aggressively, not destructively, but definitively, because the goal wasn't to break anything. The goal was to remove the illusion that I was still there holding it together. Then came the part most people would have skipped, the accountant. For years, documents had passed through me before being finalized, not because I was officially required, but because everyone trusted that if I had reviewed something, it was safe. That assumption had value, and it needed to be corrected. So I sent one final message: professional, concise, clear. Any documentation previously routed through me would now require independent verification. My review chain was no longer active. No attachments, no commentary, just fact. By that point, it was still early. The sun had barely settled into the sky, and yet something fundamental had already changed. Because what I had just done wasn't visible. No one outside those systems would notice it immediately. There was no alert, no announcement, no visible break. But internally, the structure had shifted. That's the thing about systems built on invisible labor. They don't fail loudly at first. They hesitate. Processes that once moved instantly begin to slow. Requests that once passed smoothly start requiring additional confirmation. Timelines stretch. Assumptions get questioned. And in high-stakes environments, like real estate transactions, financial transfers, care facility placements, those small delays matter. They compound. At exactly 8:43 a.m., the first sign appeared. The transaction coordinator replied, acknowledged my withdrawal, and noted that without verification, the file would require additional review before proceeding. That was the first crack. Small, technical, but real. Less than 20 minutes later, another email came through, this time from the broker. Polite, but noticeably more urgent. They needed clarification on authorization continuity, because something didn't line up anymore. Another delay, another pause. And then the third signal, the one I hadn't fully anticipated, a care liaison from the private residence my mother had been coordinating for my grandmother. Their message was careful, professional, but unmistakable in its implication. They needed updated confirmation of funding, because the deposit had been described as tied to proceeds from the townhouse purchase, which itself depended on the sale of the original property, which now appeared to be stalled. I read that message twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because it revealed something deeper than a simple delay. This wasn't just a house, it was a chain. A sequence of financial promises stacked on top of each other, and every link in that chain had one thing in common. They assumed stability, they assumed continuity, they assumed me, and now that assumption was gone. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't rush to fix anything, because for the first time I understood something clearly enough to act on it. This wasn't my emergency. It never had been. I had just been positioned to believe it was. By mid-morning, I closed my laptop, finished my coffee, and prepared to leave for work. Everything in my physical environment remained unchanged. But beneath the surface, the system my family had built was already beginning to shift under its own weight. Not because I attacked it, not because I exposed it, but because I removed the one thing it had quietly depended on all along: support. And as I walked out the door that morning, one thought settled in with a clarity I had never felt before. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had simply stopped pretending it was stable. And sometimes, that's all it takes for everything else to start falling apart. By the time I reached my office that morning, everything still looked normal. The elevator doors opened. People stepped out with coffee in hand. Screens lit up. Conversations started. The quiet rhythm of a weekday settled into place exactly as it always did. And for a moment, it almost felt like nothing had changed. But I knew better, because the kind of shift I had set in motion doesn't announce itself. It doesn't crash through doors or demand attention. It begins in the background, subtle, technical, almost invisible, until it isn't, at 9:17 a.m. And my phone vibrated once on my desk. A call. I glanced at the screen. My father. I let it ring. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but because the boundary had already been set, and for the first time, I wasn't going to blur it. The call ended. Then came another, and another. 3 calls in less than 5 minutes. I turned the phone face down and continued reviewing the audit file in front of me, because if there was one thing I understood clearly now, it was this: urgency doesn't equal responsibility. By 9:42 a.m., the first voicemail came through. I didn't listen to it immediately. I finished what I was doing, saved my work, closed the file. Only then did I press play. My father's voice sounded different, not calm, not composed, strained. "There's been some kind of misunderstanding. You need to call us back." A pause, then the message ended. 20 minutes later, another one. Shorter this time, less controlled. "You need to call us today." No explanation, no context, just pressure. I set the phone aside, because what mattered wasn't what he was saying, it was why he was saying it. And that part was already clear. Something had stopped working. At 10:08 a.m., my email was refreshed. Another message from the transaction coordinator. This one was more direct. Without proper verification, the buyer's side was refusing to proceed under the current timeline. The closing was on hold, not canceled, not failed, but paused. And in transactions like that, a pause is never just a pause. It's a signal to everyone involved that something isn't aligned. At 10:26 a.m., a second email followed. The contractor assigned to begin transition work on the old property had halted scheduling. The deposit confirmation didn't match expected processing, which meant work couldn't begin, which meant timelines shifted again, another delay, another fracture. And then, just before 11 a.m., the third message, the one that landed differently, the care facility, the same one my mother had been discussing for weeks, the one she described as perfect, private suite, prestige location. The kind of place she mentioned casually in conversations, as if everything had already been secured. Their tone was still polite, still professional, but there was a new layer underneath it. They needed updated confirmation, immediately, because the financial structure that had been presented no longer appeared consistent. That was the moment everything connected. Not just the house, not just the transaction, but the entire plan, layered, dependent, fragile. My parents hadn't just been moving, they had been positioning, building a version of their future that only worked if every piece aligned perfectly. And more importantly, if every piece was supported by me. I leaned back in my chair, not shocked, not overwhelmed, just aware. Because now I could see it clearly. The house wasn't the foundation, it was the final step, and everything before it. The sale, the funds, the care placement, the public image, had been constructed on a chain of assumptions. Assumptions that I would remain in place, that I would continue verifying, correcting, and stabilizing, that no matter what they said, I would still be there. By lunchtime, the calls had increased. I didn't count them yet, but I could feel the shift. The spacing between them is getting shorter. The pauses are getting tighter, the urgency rising, because something had changed on their side too. At first, it had probably felt like a delay, then an inconvenience, then a complication, and now it was becoming a problem. At 12:14 p.m., I finally opened the message thread. Dozens of unread notifications. My sister's name is near the top. I tapped it. Her message wasn't a question, it was an accusation. How could you do this right before the move? Mom is humiliated. Do you even understand the damage? There it was, the familiar pattern. Not what happened, not why, but blame. Immediate, confident, redirected. I stared at the screen for a moment, not because I was unsure what to say, but because I realized I didn't need to say anything at all, because nothing they were experiencing was random. Nothing was being done to them. This was the system, functioning without me, for the first time. At 12:32 p.m., another voicemail came through, this one from my mother. I didn't listen. Not yet, because I already knew what it would sound like. Controlled at first, then sharper, then demanding. Not an apology, not acknowledgement, but expectation that I would step back in, fix it, restore the flow, make everything look seamless again. But I didn't, because something had shifted inside me that morning, something quiet, but permanent. For years, I had believed that if I didn't intervene, things would collapse, and that collapse would somehow be my fault. But now, watching it unfold in real time, I saw the truth. The system wasn't stable. It had never been stable. It had only ever been maintained, and maintenance requires a person, a presence, a point of control, and that presence was gone. By early afternoon, the cracks were no longer subtle. They were visible, connected, escalating, and still, I didn't move. I didn't call back. I didn't step in. I didn't correct anything, because for the first time, I wasn't trying to hold it together. I was watching what happened when I didn't, and what I saw wasn't chaos, not yet, but it was something just as important, the beginning of it. By early afternoon, the shift was no longer subtle. It had moved past hesitation, past delays, past quiet uncertainty. Now it had a new shape, urgency, and urgency has a sound. It's faster, sharper, less controlled. At 1:07 p.m., my phone lit up again. Another call. My father. I watched it vibrate against the desk, the screen flashing his name over and over again until it finally went dark. Then, almost immediately, another. This time from my mother, then my sister, then back to my father again. The pattern was no longer spaced out. It was stacked, compressed, as if time itself had shortened on their side. I didn't pick up, not because I was trying to punish them, but because I had already answered. The moment I said okay, that was my response. Everything after that wasn't a conversation, it was consequence. By 1:32 p.m., the voicemails started coming faster. I opened the first one, my father again. But whatever composure he had tried to hold on to earlier in the morning was gone. The title company says there's a hold. Patricia said you pulled authorizations. I don't know what's going on, but this needs to be fixed today. Needs. That word stood out. Not can we talk, not help us understand, just needs, as if urgency created obligation. 20 minutes later, another voicemail, shorter, more direct. You need to call us, now. No context, no attempt at explanation, just pressure, pure and immediate. I placed the phone down and turned back to my screen, because what I was hearing wasn't new, it was familiar. This was how it always escalated. Step 1, confusion. Step 2, urgency. Step 3, expectation. And if I responded, step 4, relief. followed by silence, until the next crisis. But this time, the pattern was incomplete because I wasn't stepping into step 4. At 2:05 p.m., the group chat came alive, a space that had been silent for weeks, suddenly filled with messages. Not conversation, not concern, just activity. My sister again. How could you do this right before the move? Mom is humiliated. Do you even understand what you've caused? There it was again. Not curiosity, not accountability, just blame, immediate, absolute, unquestioned. I stared at the message for a moment, then locked my phone, because I recognized something I hadn't fully named before. They didn't think something had gone wrong. They thought I had done something. That was the assumption, that any disruption in their system had to be intentional, because the idea that it simply couldn't function without me, that wasn't something they were prepared to face. At 2:47 p.m., my phone buzzed again. This time, a transcription from my mother's voicemail. I read it, then read it again, because the precision of it was almost impressive. She called me vindictive, unstable, ungrateful, and in the same breath, demanded that I fix the paperwork immediately. No acknowledgement of the message she had sent the night before. No recognition of the boundary she had drawn, just expectation that I would ignore it, override it, step back into place. That was the moment something inside me settled completely, because it removed the last illusion. This wasn't about misunderstanding. This wasn't about stress. This wasn't even about family. This was about access, and I had just revoked it. By 3:15 p.m., the calls had multiplied, not just from my parents, unknown numbers, a broker, a contractor, voices I recognized, and some I didn't, all reaching toward the same point, all trying to reconnect a system that had just gone offline. I didn't answer any of them, not because I didn't care, but because caring and responding were no longer the same thing. And that distinction was new. By late afternoon, the tone had changed again, not just urgency now, not just pressure. Something else had entered the space. Panic. You can hear panic in the gaps. In this way, people stop explaining and start repeating. In this way, sentences are shortened. In the way control slips. At 4:02 p.m., my father called again, left another message. But this time, there was no attempt to sound composed. This is getting serious. The deal could fall through. You need to fix this before the end of day. Could fall through. Each word landed heavier than the last, because now the consequences weren't abstract. They were immediate, visible, closing in, and still, I didn't move. That evening, as I finally opened the rest of the messages, the pattern was complete. My sister again. 3 more texts, longer this time, more emotional, talking about damage, reputation, stress, everything except the one thing that mattered, responsibility, because that was the part they couldn't say, that everything they were experiencing was the result of something they had built, not something I had done. At 6:48 p.m., I finally pressed play on my mother's voicemail. I listened to it once, then again, not because I needed to understand it, but because I needed to confirm something. The tone, the certainty, the finality. It hadn't changed. Even now, even with everything starting to break around them, she still sounded the same, controlled, certain, convinced she was right. And that was the moment I understood something with complete clarity. They weren't panicking because they had lost me. They were panicking because they had lost control. There's a difference. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. By the end of that day, I hadn't said a single word. Not one call returned. Not one message answered. Not one attempt to step back in. And for the first time in years, I wasn't the one absorbing the pressure. I wasn't the one managing the fallout. I wasn't the one holding everything together while everyone else pretended it was stable. I was outside it, watching, while the system they had built, the one they were so confident would keep running without me, started to do something it had never done before: fail. By the end of the second day, the noise had changed. It wasn't just my family anymore. The calls were no longer only emotional, reactive, scattered. They had become strategic, measured, directed. And that shift mattered. Because when emotion fails to fix a problem, People look for structure, and structure brings in professionals. At 8:17 p.m., my phone lit up again. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Almost. But something about the timing, the consistency of the escalation, the way everything had been building, made me pause. Then I answered, "Miss Cross?" The voice on the other end was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that doesn't come from comfort, but from control. "This is Graham Pike. I represent your parents." I didn't speak right away. I didn't need to. Because the moment a lawyer introduces himself like that, one thing is already clear. This isn't a conversation. It's a situation. He continued carefully. Measured words, precise tone. There appear to be some complications related to an ongoing property transaction, as well as certain associated financial representations. Complications. Associated representations. Each word is deliberately chosen. Each one avoids the real language. So I interrupted. "Speak plainly." There was a pause. Brief, but noticeable. And then, he did. There is a hold on the property sequence. The care facility has raised concerns about funding confirmation, and several third parties are now requesting clarification regarding your role in these matters. There it was. Clear, direct, unavoidable. I leaned back in my chair, phone still in my hand, because now, for the first time, the situation has been translated out of emotion and into reality. This wasn't about hurt feelings. It wasn't about family conflict. It was about credibility. They presented themselves, he continued, as fully funded for a major transition. That included the purchase, the sale of the original property, and certain commitments made externally. Externally. That word mattered, because it meant the situation had moved beyond private, beyond contained, into spaces where reputation had value. "And my role?" I asked. Another pause, longer this time, careful. "They may have relied on prior understandings involving your involvement." I almost smiled, because that wasn't an answer. That was a translation. What he meant was simple. They used my name after I was gone. And that was the moment everything shifted again, not emotionally, not dramatically, but with a kind of cold certainty that settled in without resistance. Because now, this wasn't just about stepping away. This was about protection. "Did anyone," I asked slowly, "imply that I was still overseeing any part of this after I withdrew?" Silence. Then, "Some parties may have assumed continuity based on prior arrangements." Assumed. Another careful word, another controlled deflection, but it was enough. Because assumptions don't appear out of nowhere. They're built, fed, maintained. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not panic, not anger, something sharper, clearer. Because now the risk wasn't just theirs, it was mine. If this collapsed, and it would, my name wouldn't just disappear. It would linger. In conversations, in documents, in expectations that no longer matched reality, and in professional spaces, that matters. "I will communicate in writing," I said. Simple, final, clean. He shifted tone slightly then, not aggressive, but more direct. "There is a great deal at stake here. Your parents are under significant pressure. Your grandmother's transition—" I cut him off, because I recognized the strategy immediately. Emotion, reframed as urgency, used to reopen access. "A serious problem for them," I said evenly, "does not create an obligation for me." Silence again. This time, longer. Because there was nothing to counter that. No angle, no leverage, no emotional entry point left. "Understood," he said finally. Professional, neutral, contained, but different. Because now the conversation had shifted fully, from negotiation to boundary. I ended the call, set the phone down, and sat there for a moment without moving, because something important had just happened, something that couldn't be reversed. For years, I had been the invisible layer that kept everything stable, the quiet assurance behind decisions that shouldn't have been made, the credibility that allowed risks to look like strategy. But now, that layer was gone, and worse, it had been replaced with exposure. Because once a lawyer is involved, the narrative changes. It's no longer about fixing things. It's about documenting what went wrong, Who was responsible? What can be defended? And what can't? And somewhere in that process, they realized something too. I wasn't coming back. I wasn't picking up the calls. I wasn't stepping into the gap. I wasn't restoring the system. And without that, everything they had built, every assumption, every projection, every carefully maintained image, I was now sitting in the open air, unverified, unstable, and increasingly unraveling. I picked up my phone one last time that night, scrolled through the missed calls, the messages, the growing list of attempts to reach me, and then I placed it face down on the table. Because for the first time, I understood the real problem. It wasn't that they had lost support. It was that they had built everything on the belief that they never would. By the third morning, the situation had stopped feeling like a disruption. It had taken on a different shape entirely. Not chaos, not yet, but something more dangerous, exposure. I arrived at work earlier than usual, not because I was trying to stay ahead of anything, but because my mind hadn't really slowed down since the call with the lawyer. There was a pattern forming. Pieces that had once seemed separate were starting to connect, and I had learned something over the years. When things don't add up, you don't ignore them, you follow them. So instead of opening my usual files, I went back to something I had almost overlooked, an email thread, buried, quiet, routine on the surface, but now different. It was from the care liaison at the private residence my mother had been coordinating for my grandmother, the same place she had been describing for weeks, elegant, exclusive, exactly what Grandma deserves. I opened the thread, read it slowly, then again. They weren't asking for payment. That's what I noticed first. They weren't demanding anything. Not yet. They were asking for confirmation. Specifically, whether the funding structure previously described by the family was still valid. Because according to their records, the deposit had been represented as tied to proceeds from the townhouse purchase, which in turn depended on the successful sale of the original property, which was now on hold. I sat back in my chair, because that wasn't just a request. It was a chain, a financial sequence, a dependency structure, and every link in that chain was conditional. The townhouse hadn't closed. The old property hadn't been sold. The funds weren't liquid. And yet, commitments had already been made. That's when it clicked. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but with a quiet precision that left no room for denial. This wasn't a plan. It was a performance. My mother hadn't just been preparing for a move. She had been presenting one, projecting stability, projecting control, projecting certainty in places where none of those things actually existed. I went back through the thread again, slower this time, looking not at what was being said, but at what had already been implied. The language was careful, professional, but underneath it, there was something else. Concern. Not about payment, but about consistency. Because in environments like that, private care, high-level services, donor-adjacent networks, consistency isn't optional. It's currency. And right now, the story didn't match the structure. I closed the email and sat still for a moment, because this wasn't just about a delayed transaction anymore. It wasn't even just about money. It was about image. My mother sat on a fundraising committee. She moved in spaces where perception mattered, where stability wasn't just expected, it was assumed. And now I could see it clearly. She had extended that image outward, into conversations, into commitments, into promises that depended on outcomes that hadn't happened yet. And she had done it with confidence, because she believed those outcomes would hold, because they always had, because I had always made sure they did. Until now. I opened another file, then another, tracing back small details I hadn't paid attention to before, mentions of timelines that were too optimistic, references to coordination that hadn't actually been finalized, language that suggested completion where there was only intent. It wasn't fraud, it wasn't illegal, it was something more familiar. Overextension, the kind that builds slowly, quietly, layer by layer, until the structure looks solid, but it can't support its own weight. And at the center of it was my grandmother. That realization landed harder than anything else, because this wasn't just about real estate or social positioning or even financial risk. She had been included in the narrative, placed into the plan, used as part of the justification for moving forward quickly, for securing something better, for presenting the entire transition as necessary. But the reality was simpler and colder. Her care wasn't secured. It was assumed. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, because now I understood something I hadn't fully seen before. They weren't just relying on me to stabilize transactions. They were relying on me to make their version of reality real, to bridge the gap between what they promised and what they actually had. And when that bridge disappeared, everything underneath it became visible. I checked the timestamps again, the sequence, the order of events. The commitments had been made before the structure was secured. The narrative had been built before the foundation existed, and the only reason it had ever worked, it was because I had been there to hold it in place, until I wasn't. My phone buzzed again. Another call, another message. I didn't check it. Not yet. Because something more important had already happened. The situation had changed. Not externally. That part was still unfolding, but internally. In the way I understood it, this wasn't about being hurt or excluded or even disrespected. This was about being used, not emotionally, not abstractly, but structurally, as a point of stability in a system that had none. And once I saw that clearly, everything else became simpler. Because the question was no longer, should I step in? It was, why would I rebuild something that was never real to begin with? By the time the third day came to an end, something else had begun to take shape. Not just pressure, not just panic, but something far more calculated, a narrative. Up until that point, everything had remained contained within a closed system. The calls, the messages, the emails, the confusion, all of it existed between family members, brokers, coordinators, and a handful of professionals trying to keep things from slipping too far out of alignment. But systems like that don't stay closed when they start to fail. In fact, the moment internal control begins to slip, the instinct is almost always the same. Control the external perception before anyone else defines it for you. And that was exactly what my mother did. It started quietly. A forwarded message, no context, no explanation, just a single line above it. You might want to see what's being said. I almost ignored it. At that point, I already knew enough to understand what was happening, but something about the tone, careful, deliberate, made me open it anyway. It was an event invitation, polished and deliberate, the kind designed to project stability at a glance. A donor evening, hosted by my mother. The location had been changed from the townhouse she had been promising to a historic conservatory. The explanation was subtle, almost elegant, due to logistical refinements. I read that line twice because I knew exactly what it meant. The townhouse didn't exist, not in the way she had presented it, but that wasn't the part that stayed with me. What mattered was the paragraph beneath it. She had introduced herself as a caregiver under extraordinary strain, a woman balancing her aging mother's future while dealing with an estranged daughter who had chosen resentment over responsibility. I didn't react immediately, not with anger, not with shock. What I felt instead was something quieter, something colder, recognition, because this wasn't new. This was just a larger, more public version of something I had lived with for years. Whenever something broke, I became the explanation. Whenever something didn't align, I became the problem. The difference now was scale. This wasn't happening behind closed doors anymore. It was being projected outward, into rooms where perception carried weight, where reputation influenced decisions, where credibility translated directly into opportunity. And my name, whether spoken or implied, was still part of that structure. That was the moment everything shifted. Up until then, I had been willing to remain silent, to step back, to let the system collapse under its own weight without interference. But silence in this context wasn't neutral. It was permission. permission for them to define the story, permission for my withdrawal to be reframed as instability rather than what it actually was, a boundary. I leaned back in my chair, letting that realization settle fully, because now the situation had crossed into something else entirely. This was no longer just emotional or personal, it was professional. If their version of events took hold, if that narrative settled into place unchallenged, then the consequences wouldn't stop with them. It would reach me. Quietly, indirectly, but undeniably. Because in my field, credibility doesn't erode all at once. It shifts. It gets questioned in small ways, in subtle conversations, in raised eyebrows that don't need to say anything out loud. And once that process starts, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads. So I read the invitation again, slowly. Not as a daughter this time, but as someone trained to analyze systems, to identify inconsistencies, to track risk. And the inconsistencies were everywhere. The timeline didn't align with the transaction status. The confidence didn't match the underlying structure. The claims of stability stood on foundations that were already cracking. But the most important inconsistency was this. She was speaking as though I had abandoned something stable, when in reality, the only thing that had changed was my presence. And without that presence, the instability had simply become visible. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the messages again. The accusations, the urgency, the pressure. And now layered over all of it, the narrative. It was almost precise in its construction. Private chaos contained, public image preserved, blame redirected with just enough emotional framing to make it believable, except for one flaw. It depended entirely on me staying silent. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I would. Not because I wanted to expose them, not because I wanted to humiliate them, but because this was no longer about emotion. This was about accuracy. There is a difference between revenge and self-defense, and what was happening now clearly belonged to the latter. If I allowed that version of events to settle, then I wouldn't just be the daughter they had pushed out. I would become the professional who had failed quietly in the background of their story. And that was something I could not accept. I set my phone down slowly, not reacting, not rushing, just thinking. Because once a story moves into public space, it doesn't stay fluid for long. It solidifies. It becomes accepted. It becomes truth, not because it's accurate, but because it's repeated without interruption. And the only way to stop that process is to interrupt it early, before it takes hold. For the first time since all of this began, I wasn't just observing anymore. I was deciding. Because the system wasn't just collapsing. It was being rewritten. And whether I stayed silent or spoke up would determine which version survived. By the time the evening of the event arrived, the situation had already crossed every line I once believed I wouldn't touch. What began as a private withdrawal had become a public distortion, and that distortion was now being reinforced in a room full of people whose opinions carried weight. For the first time, I understood that doing nothing was no longer neutral. It was participation. So I went, not to confront, not to create a scene, and certainly not to perform some dramatic reveal designed to humiliate anyone. I went for one reason only, to correct the record. The conservatory was exactly what you would expect. Glass walls reflecting soft evening light, polished wood underfoot, carefully arranged greenery that made everything feel curated, intentional, expensive. Conversations floated through the air, quiet and measured, punctuated by soft laughter and the clink of glassware. It was the kind of environment where everything appeared stable, even when it wasn't. I saw my mother immediately. She stood near the center of the room, smiling in that practiced way I had seen my entire life, the version of her that only existed when there were witnesses. My father was nearby, speaking to someone I recognized from a regional board. My sister stood off to the side, laughing just a little too loudly, her posture tight in a way that betrayed everything she was trying to hide. For a moment, I simply observed, because before anything is said, you can learn a lot just by watching. Then my mother saw me, and for one brief, unguarded second, her expression broke. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. She recovered quickly, of course. She always did. Her smile returned, controlled and precise, as she moved toward me with the same calm authority she used in every public setting. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice low, her expression unchanged for anyone watching. I met her gaze. "I was invited," I said evenly, "into the story you've been telling." That landed, not loudly, but sharply. She tried to redirect immediately, placing a light hand near my arm, guiding me subtly toward the side of the room, away from attention. "This isn't the place," she murmured. And for a moment, I understood exactly what she meant. Not the event, the truth. That wasn't the place she wanted it. But I didn't move. "You made it the place," I replied just as quietly, "when you used my name to hold your version together." There was a shift then, small but noticeable. Two nearby guests turned slightly, not enough to intrude, but enough to sense tension. My mother's expression tightened beneath the surface of her composure. She lowered her voice further. "Everyone already knows you've been difficult," she said, "unstable, vindictive, pulling support during a family crisis." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt. I simply asked. "By support," I said calmly, "do you mean my credibility, my labor, or the authorization you continued using after telling me not to contact you?" That was the first real break, because this time, my father heard it. He was close enough to catch every word, and for the first time since I arrived, he didn't speak. He looked down. My sister moved quickly then, stepping in with urgency barely contained. "Can you not do this here?" she whispered sharply. "Mom is barely holding it together." I looked at her, really looked, and saw something familiar. Fear dressed as frustration, and I answered with the simplest truth I had. "Interesting," I said, "because I remember all of you being very committed to moving forward without me." She reached for my arm, and that was her mistake, not because it hurt, but because it drew attention. A shift in posture, a glance from across the room, a pause in conversation. Small things, but in rooms like this, small things spread quickly. My mother adjusted instantly, raising her voice just enough to be heard without sounding aggressive. "Ava, please," she said, her tone now carrying a note of public concern. "This is about your grandmother." There it was, the emotional anchor. The line was designed to make any resistance look cruel, but I didn't react to it. Instead, I answered with something quieter. "Then let's talk about Grandma." And just like that, the room changed. Not loudly, but completely. Because silence, in spaces like this, doesn't crash. It freezes. I asked my mother whether the care facility had been informed that the deposit depended on a closing that hadn't happened. I asked my father whether the buyer had been told the full extent of the property repairs. I asked my sister whether she had told people I was still overseeing compliance after I had formally withdrawn. No accusations, no raised voice, just questions, clear, precise, documented, and impossible to ignore. My mother tried to interrupt, calling me cruel. My father said this was private. My sister began to cry, but by then, it didn't matter, because the wrong people were listening. A trustee stepped closer. "Was Ms. Cross still involved in the transition?" he asked carefully. I turned to him. "Not after I was told not to contact them again," I said. "I have the voicemail, the withdrawal notices, and the timestamps if there's any confusion." That was it. That was the moment the structure broke, not emotionally, not dramatically, but structurally. Because what mattered in that room wasn't volume, it was consistency. And for the first time, their story didn't have it. My mother still went, not angry, cornered. My father looked like he might sit down. My sister kept repeating that it was a misunderstanding, but no one was listening to her anymore. And then someone else spoke, a donor, older, calm. The kind of person who doesn't need to raise their voice to be heard. "Were charitable commitments discussed," she asked evenly, "before your own financial position was secure?" It was a precise question, and it cut cleanly through everything, because everyone in that room understood what it meant. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it, and for the first time that evening, she had no narrative left. I didn't stay to watch what came next. I didn't need to, because the outcome was already set. The moment the illusion cracked in front of the right people, It couldn't be rebuilt. As I walked toward the exit, I felt something unfamiliar. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter, final. Because I hadn't destroyed anything. I had simply said what was true. And sometimes, that's all it takes to bring everything else down. The days after the event didn't explode. They tightened. Everything drew inward like a system trying to contain a breach. The calls kept coming, but the tone shifted. Less outrage, more calculation. Messages arrived longer, then shorter, then carefully neutral. It wasn't chaos anymore. It was damage control. 3 days later, my father texted, "We need to talk. In person. One conversation. No arguments." I stared at the message longer than I expected, not because I believed it would be different, but because I understood what it meant. This wasn't about resolution, it was about containment. Still, I agreed, not to fix anything, to finish it. The house felt wrong the moment I stepped inside, half-packed, half-abandoned, furniture wrapped in gray covers, boxes stacked in uneven lines along the hallway. The air carried that stale quiet that settles in when a place is no longer being lived in, only processed. My mother was already seated at the dining table, posture perfect, expression composed. My father stood by the window, arms crossed, looking out as if something might appear to explain all of this away. My sister sat to the side, eyes red but dry, tension coiled beneath a thin layer of control. So much for one conversation. I took a seat. No one offered anything. No water, no greeting, just presence. They started with revision. My mother said the voicemail had been sent in a moment, not meant to be taken literally. My father spoke about pressure, timelines, financial stress, how quickly everything had escalated. My sister insisted no one had misused my name. They had simply assumed continuity. Assumed. Always that word, clean, convenient, empty of responsibility. I didn't interrupt. I let them finish because I had learned that people will reveal more when they believe they're being heard. When the room finally went quiet, I placed the documents on the table, not all at once, one by one. The revocation notice, the coordinator's confirmation, the broker correspondence, the accountant's email, the care liaison inquiry, the event invitation, the timestamps, each piece aligned with the next. Each one closed a gap they were trying to leave open. The room changed, not dramatically, structurally, because facts remove space. My mother reacted first. Her expression didn't collapse. It sharpened. "You've always enjoyed this," she said, voice tight, making everything sound worse than it is. Acting like you're the only one who understands anything. There it was. No explanation, no apology, resentment. My father followed, his voice lower but harder. "This didn't have to happen. If you had just helped us instead of stepping back like this, helped." As if that had ever been the question. Then my sister spoke, faster than she intended. "You always act like the money was yours." I looked at her. "Not the money," I said. "The consequences." Silence followed, because that was the part they had never owned. Not the access, not the benefits, the consequences. My mother leaned forward then, composure slipping just enough to show what was underneath. "You owed us cooperation," she said, "after everything we've done for you." Owed. The words settled into the room like a verdict, and suddenly, everything made sense. The late nights, the emergencies, the expectations without limits. It had never been helped. It had been collected. I felt something inside me go still, not numb, not angry, finished. "I'm done," I said. No emphasis, no escalation, just fact. I won't restore access. I won't attach my name to anything. I won't intervene with the broker, the board, the facility, or anyone else. Whatever explanations are needed, you'll make them yourselves. My father exhaled sharply. "That's cruel." My mother shook her head. "You're abandoning your family." And then my sister tried the last lever. "What about Grandma?" she said, softer now. "You're just going to let her suffer because of this?" That line used to work. It used to pull me back in every time, because it reframed everything as urgency, as care, as something bigger than the pattern underneath it. But this time, it didn't land. I looked at her, then my mother. "The person who put her at risk," I said evenly, "is the one who built a plan that depended on money you didn't have." No one answered. Because there was nothing to argue with, only something to accept. My mother's hand hit the table, not hard, but sharp. "You're tearing this family apart." "No," I said. I stopped holding it together. That was the line that ended it, because it removed the last illusion they had left, that this was about conflict or misunderstanding or timing. It wasn't. It was about structure, and the structure was gone. I stood. No one tried to stop me this time, not physically, not even verbally. They had already said everything they had: revision, blame, obligation, emotion. None of it changed the facts sitting between us. As I walked toward the door, their voices rose behind me, not in conversation, but in reaction. Overlapping, fractured, directionless. For years, that sound would have pulled me back, made me turn around, made me fix it. But now, it just sounded like noise. I stepped outside. The air felt different, not lighter, not dramatic, just clear. Because something had finally ended. Not a healthy relationship that had broken, but a role that had been assigned, reinforced, and expected without question. They hadn't asked me to come back, not really. They had asked me to resume the function, to reconnect the system, to restore the illusion. And for the first time in my life, I didn't. The fallout didn't arrive like a storm. It didn't crash all at once, loud and undeniable. Instead, it unfolded the way fragile systems always do, piece by piece, failure by failure, until what once looked stable could no longer hold its shape. Over the next 6 weeks, everything my family had built began to come apart. Not dramatically, not in a single moment anyone could point to, but permanently. The first collapse was the property. The sale of the old house didn't just slow down, it broke. The buyer requested deeper disclosures, repairs that could no longer be minimized, credits my parents couldn't absorb without exposing everything underneath. Without verification, without consistency, without the quiet corrections I had always made behind the scenes, the deal failed. And once that happened, everything connected to it shifted. The townhouse, the one my mother had already described as secured, was gone within days. Another buyer stepped in with clean documentation and actual liquidity. No hesitation, no complications. Because in transactions like that, confidence isn't about how things sound. It's about what can be proven. And proof they no longer had. Then came the care facility. The same place my mother had spoken about with certainty and pride withdrew the reservation. Quietly. Professionally. No confrontation, no accusations, just a statement that the financial structure presented no longer aligned with their requirements. And that was enough. My mother never spoke about that part publicly, but internally the impact was clear. She was asked to step back from her position on the charity committee. Not removed outright, not publicly criticized, just pending clarification. In those circles, that phrasing carries weight. It means trust has shifted, and once that happens, it doesn't easily return. My sister's life unraveled next, not in a dramatic collapse, but in small exposures that added up. The emergency line she had quietly drained became visible once no one was covering it. The lifestyle she had been maintaining, carefully curated, selectively presented, started to fracture under the pressure of reality, and the people she relied on to believe that image stopped believing. My father changed in a way I hadn't expected, not emotionally, but practically. He took on work he used to dismiss, consulting, short-term contracts, anything that could stabilize what was left. For years, he had operated above consequence, supported by systems he didn't fully understand. Now, without that support, every decision carried weight. And my grandmother, that was the only place I chose to intervene, but not the way they expected. I didn't step back into their system. I didn't restore access or fix their structure. Instead, I went around it, through a separate, documented channel. Quietly and with clear boundaries, I worked with a social contact outside their network to secure a placement that was stable, realistic, and honest. No prestige, No performance, just care. When my mother found out, she called, and for the first time, there was no control in her voice, only accusation. She said I had humiliated her, that I had downgraded my grandmother's future. That word, downgraded, stayed with me because it revealed everything. To her, care had never been about safety or stability. It had been about image. That was the moment I stopped explaining, stopped justifying, stopped trying to be understood. From that point forward, I created distance, not emotional distance, but structural distance. All communication shifted to writing. Every response became minimal, precise, documented. Anything outside that, I didn't engage with. Not out of anger, but out of clarity, because I finally understood something I hadn't before. You don't need to convince everyone. You don't need to correct every version of the story. You don't need to be understood by people who benefit from misunderstanding you. You only need to stop participating in the version of yourself they depend on. Some extended family reached out. Some believed me immediately. Others didn't. That used to matter. It doesn't anymore. Because once you step out of a role like that, you realize something simple. You were never the audience. You were the stage. About a month later, the lawyer contacted me again, not to pressure, not to negotiate, but to request a formal statement clarifying the timeline of my withdrawal, when I revoked access, when I stepped back, what I was no longer responsible for. I wrote it exactly as I would any professional document, clean, precise, no emotion, no commentary, just facts. Because facts don't argue. They don't escalate. They don't need to. They stand. And once those facts were recorded, the narrative shifted, not loudly, not publicly, but structurally. Because once my name was separated from their actions, there was nothing left to redirect. The last meeting happened after that. In a law office, neutral ground, witnessed. My mother looked smaller, not broken, not transformed, just reduced. She didn't apologize. She explained. Stress, pressure, everything that had happened to her. I let her speak, and when she finished, I answered simply, "You told me not to contact you again. I respected that. You continued using what I built after removing me. That's why everything collapsed." She cried then, real tears, but tears aren't truth. They're reaction. Then she asked the question she should have asked years earlier. "Is there anything we can do to fix this?" I understood what she meant. Not accountability, restoration. A way back to what they had before. But some things shouldn't be rebuilt, not because they can't, but because they shouldn't. So I told her the truth. You can't fix this with me. You can only live with it without turning me into the solution again. My father asked if that meant I was cutting them off forever. I shook my head. No, you did that first. I'm just not stepping back in. Then I stood, walked out, and didn't look back. Months later, I signed for my own condo. Alone. No messages, no approval, no explanation. Just a clean signature, a clean title, and a silence that didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Some people think revenge has to be loud, dramatic, visible, but sometimes it looks like this. Documentation, boundaries, and the quiet decision to stop holding everything together for people who only valued you when you did. Because in the end, I didn't destroy their lives. I just stopped being the system that kept them running. There's a hard truth at the center of this entire story. Not every family is built on love. Some are built on function. And the moment you stop being useful, you discover what your role really was. Elena didn't lose her family. She lost a system that only worked because she kept sacrificing herself to hold it together. And that leads to the real lesson. Boundaries are not betrayal. Walking away is not cruelty. And choosing yourself is not selfish, especially when the only alternative is slowly disappearing inside someone else's expectations. Because if someone only values you when you fix their problems, then they never valued you, only what you could do for them. But here's the part most people don't talk about. Walking away won't feel powerful at first. It will feel quiet, lonely, uncertain, until one day it feels like peace. So let me ask you this. Are you being loved, or are you just being used? If this story made you think about your own life, don't ignore that feeling. Follow the channel for more real stories like this, stories that don't just entertain, but make you see things differently. And if you've ever had to choose yourself over people who didn't choose you, share your story below, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop being the one who holds everything together